What's up guys? Today we will be going through the basics of the Unreal Engine 4 editor. My name is Cairo and I will be taking you through the tutorial today. I'm a fourth year civil engineering student studying in South Africa, and I've been working on Unreal Engine for about 18 months now. It's a really great tool and I strongly recommend anyone who hasn't tried it to give it a go. So today, as you can see, I have the Epic Games launcher open over here. I have all my different versions of Unreal Engine which are installed. For today, I'm going to be using 4.19.1. I have the newest release, which is 4.20, but I've heard that there are quite a few bugs with it still, or rather, they are yet to release a hotfix for it. I think that was actually released today, 4.20.1. So definitely keep up to date with the newest version of the engine. So this is my library. These are all my previous projects. So today we're going to go through how to start a new project and how to navigate your way through the viewport. So we're going to launch the Unreal Engine over here, and then there will be a pop-up with the project name and all of that, and then we'll be able to start a new project. This little window will pop up with your engine version over here, and we'll start to create the project. And once this is done, you can choose the format for the project that you will be starting. Once that splash screen has finally loaded itself, you will be able to go over here to open a new project. Now you have the option to either select a blueprint project or a C++ project. For the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to select a blueprint project. If you are more accustomed to C++, then you are more than welcome to choose that. Then we have quite a few options over here based on what kind of settings you would like for your project, what kind of project you think it is going to be. Just for now, we're going to choose a third-person template. Now over here, we have to choose whether we would like this project to be optimized for desktop or mobile or tablet. As I'm working on a desktop right now, obviously I'm going to choose that. Now for this, we are obviously going to also choose maximum quality for now. But as I said, it depends entirely upon your preference. The starter content is basically very simple geometry meshes that Unreal has included, such as simple steps and cubes and spheres and the like. It also includes a few custom textures that you might need for your materials and stuff like that, so we're going to leave it in for now. It doesn't take up too much space, so you might as well. Over here is obviously our save directory, so we're just going to keep it as is. We will call this UE4 editor basics. Now we're going to just create the project. Now it will have to load all the assets, and this will take about 30 seconds. Now that we have the editor open, we can finally get started. Now if you're looking at all this for the first time, there's quite an overwhelming amount of information on the screen right now, but we're going to work through all of this step by step sequentially, and we will get through it all. Now first of all, we are going to learn how to navigate through the viewport, which we have over here. So we're going to go through some shortcut keys. First of all, if you want to get rid of the taskbar at the bottom, you can hold down Shift and F11, and that will maximize this window. Then, if you want to maximize whatever viewport you happen to be in, you can just hit F11, and then this will be maximized. If you would like to navigate around the viewport, as I'm doing right now, all you have to do is hold down the right mouse button and the W, S, A, and D keys. If you need to go directly up or directly down, you can also hold down the right mouse button and E or Q. You can also hold down the left mouse button and move your mouse around to navigate as I'm doing right now. This is obviously affected by the camera speed button, which is over here. obviously if I increase this, we're going to be moving much more quickly. Now we're going to talk about how to scale, rotate, and position all the static meshes inside our level. So this is a static mesh. It's basically just a very basic cube, and as you can see over here, we have our blue, red, and green arrows, which will tell us how we are going to move it. Okay, as you can see over here, you have these three little buttons which will determine what type of transformation you will be applying. So right now we are in the select and translate objects mode, which can also be selected with the W key. If we would like to switch to rotation, we can hit E, and then you will get this, which shows you how you can rotate everything. Lastly, if we would like to scale our object along a certain axis, we can hit R for the scaling menu, and then we can do that. So that's basically it for the scaling and positioning and navigating our way through the viewport. As you can see, after I made some changes to this mesh, we got this warning over here that says lighting needs to be rebuilt, one object. So this is because we changed this one object, and now the baked lighting that we have been using no longer applies. What this means is that the engine needs to take into account all the light sources in the scene, such as the sun and any other point lights or directional lights you might have, and it needs to take into account how this light bounces off the scene and reflects onto other objects, and basically how it casts a shadow. So these calculations had already been taken out before we moved and translated this static mesh. You'll see that if I do the same, you can see that there's actually a shadow baked underneath the staircase, because that's what the baked lighting had done last time. So we're going to go through this in detail in our lighting and core concepts video, but just so that you can get rid of this pesky notification right now, we're just going to go up here and click build, so that the lighting's calculations can be done and that all our shadows can be rendered correctly. Now after this, we'll be building the texture streaming. It'll determine how each texture in the level should look, and when this is done, then we can continue. When the lighting build is being done, you will see that the message log will pop up with any errors you might have inside your level at the moment. This can range from anything from overlapping UVs or incorrectly imported meshes, but at the moment the only error we have is that our lighting needs to be rebuilt, which you can see it is doing in the corner over here. This build time will increase depending on your quality settings, but as I said, that is for another video. So I'm just going to go ahead and close our message log. As you can see, our lighting build is now complete, and we now have a correctly rendered shadow and lighting for our new arrangement of meshes. Next, we're going to work through the details tab over here. So as you can see, I have this staircase selected. So in the details tab over here, this linear stair static mesh has been selected. First of all, before we look at that, you can see that there are these various options over here. This is just simply a more precise way of positioning your mesh with your rotation at its scale. If you lock this scale over here, whatever value you change it to over here, it will scale linearly. So I'm just going to change that back. So now, as I said, here is our static mesh. We're going to go through what these three buttons do over here. Essentially, this yellow arrow, whenever you see it, means reset to default. So if I were to do that right now, it would reset it to the default static mesh, which in this case is none. We're just going to undo that. So now you can see that that arrow has disappeared. Now this button, the magnifying glass, means we are going to browse to this specific asset inside the content browser over here, wherever it may be located. So very simply, we click that and it shows us where it is located under content, third person, and meshes. Now this button is similar but not quite. It uses the selected asset from the content browser. So whatever is selected on the left over here will then change this one. So for example, if I click this right arm static mesh and click this button, it will change that static mesh to the one that is currently selected in the content browser. We don't want that, so I'm just going to Control Z to change that. Then next we have the Materials tab. This essentially gives us information based on the current material that is applied to our object. So it's much quicker than looking for the material that you might need inside your content browser and then dragging it onto the material. So as you can see, we have our very simple ramp material applied here. The same controls apply over here, and you can use any of those buttons as you wish. The physics tab we are not going to look through at the moment. All you need to know is that Unreal has the ability to simulate physics for objects, therefore that they can be moved around, knocked around, hit, and a multitude of other things. If you have a skeletal mesh, which is what our third person character is over here, with bones and armature, it's basically been rigged to have a skeleton. You can use the physics asset of that skeletal mesh in order to realistically simulate ragdoll animations. As I said, we'll go through that at a later stage. For now, let's look at the collision tab. All these other tabs we will look at a different time. Now you can see that in the collision tab, for this stair mesh, it has a collision. For example, if we were to change this to no collision, if we were to play in our editor over here, you can see that we now go right through that staircase. This is obviously dependent on your needs, and yes. Okay. Now that we've gone through the details panel, we are going to go through all 5 of these different modes up here on the left. So we have 5 different modes in Unreal, each with their own specific purpose. First of all, we have our place mode over here, which is just as simple as dragging and dropping different static meshes, volumes, functions, whatever you can think of, right from the tab over here. This obviously can also be done from the content browser. So, simply as that, all that tab is for is placing various different actors, volumes, functions, geometry, lights inside your scene. So it's a very basic tab. Next, we have our paint tab. As you can see, there are various different settings over here. If I were to drag my mouse into the scene right now, you can now see I have this sort of paintbrush tool, which is now on this floor mesh. But if I hold down my left mouse button and sort of drag it around, you can see that nothing's being painted. Now, this is not because I'm doing anything wrong at the moment, it's just because the ability to paint needs to be sort of programmed into a material. So this will be covered at a later stage. It is called vertex painting, and it's one of the most useful tools within the Unreal Engine. But for now, we're going to leave it. All you need to know is that this exists, and we can move on. we're going to look very briefly at the landscape tool over here. So you either have the option to create a new landscape or to import one from a file. This is done by using a height map, which is simply a grayscale image which represents a certain terrain or height. Basically, it takes black, white, and in-between values to represent high and low points on a map. So if you have a height map, you can import that, and then it can be styled however you like. But for now, we're going to create a new landscape. As you can see in the viewport over here, this green grid has appeared, and this is the size of the landscape we are going to be creating at the moment. For now, we don't want such a big landscape, so I'm just going to make the section size smaller and make it 7 by 7 quads. This is the number of sections in a single landscape component. It is defaulted between 1 by 1 and 2 by 2. So if I were to click over here, you can see that it's become a bit more complex. Depending on the section size and the sections per component, you can see that our overall resolution changes. So if I change this to the biggest landscape possible, you see that our resolution is much greater than the smallest landscape possible. So now we can either choose to fill the world or create. I'm just going to create at the moment, and now you can see that we have this world grid material landscape. You can see at the top here we have the choice to either manage, sculpt, or paint on our landscape. As I said, for the normal paint tab, this is also possible with landscapes because it does not use the regular paint tab, rather it will use the landscape paint tab. As you can see, at the moment it is also not possible. This is because we have to add a landscape material layer to our landscape material in order to do this. This will be done at a later stage, but for now we are just going to look at the sculpt functions of the landscape tool. So now we have all these different settings over here, such as our tool strength and our brush size, which I'm just going to reduce just for the sake of this tutorial, maybe a bit bigger. Okay, and then you can see at the moment we are in the sculpt tool. So if I hold down the mouse button here, you can see that our landscape will start to raise as I paint. This is just one of many tools that is offered. There's also the smooth, flatten, ramp, erosion, hydro erosion, and noise tools, as well as a few others that you can see over here. You can look through these in your own time. At the moment, we're just going through the very basics. All you need to know is that all these options are possible. For example, if I click on the flatten option here, it will take the point at where my paintbrush is positioned and it will raise all the points around it to that specific height. So if I zoom out over here, you can see that our landscape is actually changing between different heights. That is because of something called a level of detail, or LOD. So basically, in order for your console or PC or phone to not have to load such complex meshes all at once, which will probably result in it crashing, it uses a level of detail. So when the player camera is further and further away from this landscape or mesh, it will reduce the level of detail in order to save processing power effectively. As you get closer, it will reveal all the details that you need. As you can see here, we now also have a lighting needs to be built warning again, and you can see that it is 64 unbuilt objects. That's because the number of components that we created in our landscape when we created it was 64. So you can see we now have these ugly black lines along our landscape. These will only disappear once the lighting has been rebuilt. You can also, if you're in the placement mode, you can select your landscape and move it and scale it as you desire. For now though, we're going to delete the landscape because we are not going to use it at the moment. Next, we are going to go through the foliage mode, which is over here. As I'm sure you all know, foliage, generally when you think of it, is trees and bushes and grass and basically anything that you see in abundance in a landscape. So we have various different options over here. You can see that BSP is ticked over here. We'll get into that later when we look at geometry. But for now, we're not actually going to add grass or anything because in our starter content here, we don't have a grass mesh, but I'm just going to drag and drop this ramp inside our foliage types. So now if I just drag this down, you need to make sure that the mesh that you would like to add to your scene is ticked in this box over here. As you can see, this is also a paint mode, so if I hold down my left mouse button, we have a lot of cubes over there, or rather ramps. As you can see, the function of the foliage tool rather is to populate your scene with multiple instances of foliage. There are also a few options over here which we can look at. If I select this ramp, it shows us the mesh that we are using and telling us that it is foliage. Now this is the density that the paintbrush will place these instances per square kilometer. So at the moment we will have 100 ramps per square kilometer. We don't want so many, let's maybe make that 15. And then this radius is the distance between these instances, so it can vary. But for now, let's make the distance between these 50 units. And then you can also have a difference in scale of your things. Obviously, if you are adding trees or grass or bushes to your scene, you don't want to have to manually place them by hand one by one, and you also don't want to have to scale them so that they look different. So that is why we have this function where we are going to have a range of scales in the x-axis. So let's make this between 0.2 and 0.5, let's say. You can also do this with your vertex colors, but as I said, we will look at that later. So now if I paint again, perhaps with a smaller brush, you can see that we are getting multiple instances of our foliage, which in this case is the ramp. So now that we've gone through the foliage tool, if we go back to the placement mode, you can see if I click on our foliage, it is all one object, which can be moved as a group but cannot be moved separately. So be careful how you position your foliage within your foliage mode, as it cannot be changed within your placement mode. I'm just going to delete these. Before we do that though, notice that the lighting now needs to be rebuilt again, but that all our foliage counts as one unbuilt object. This is one of the many advantages to using the foliage tool, is that you do not have to rebuild hundreds and hundreds of trees and grass and anything else. As I said, I'm just going to delete our foliage for now so that we can go through our last mode, which is geometry. So I'm going to click on the tab here, and you can see that we have these options over here. So I'm going to click on this static mesh over here, but if I try and select any of these modes over here, nothing really will happen to the static mesh. That is because any static mesh cannot be used for geometry editing. You need a BSP type of mesh in order to do this. And what BSP stands for is a binary space partitioning. So designers use BSPs to basically block out their levels so that they have a rough idea of where everything should go and how everything should look. So if I go back to my placement mode over here and click on geometry, Here we have a few different meshes which are BSPs. You can now see that you either have the option to add or subtract them. At the moment, I'm just going to add this box BSP. And you can see already that it looks a little bit different to our traditional static meshes. If I go to the geometry mode, you now see that the mesh turns blue and you have the option to edit it. So now you can simply select any of these vertices and move them however you would like. And then you have various different other options over here. You can extrude different areas, you can subdivide your mesh, but I will leave that to you to look through. All you need to know for the moment is that for the geometry mode, you need to use BSPs. If I hit apply over here and go back to the placement mode, you can see that we now have this mesh, which is a lot more customizable. Just another shortcut key quickly to enter your editor and to play. You can hit Alt and P and that will start the simulation, and then you just hit escape to exit it. Okay, we have now gone through all the modes. I'm just going to delete that because we don't need it anymore. Now what we're going to look at is all these different settings inside the viewport. We mentioned earlier what these three buttons do, but I didn't mention the function of these. So if we are to move this static mesh, the cube, if we do this, every time it moves, you can sort of see that it is jumping a certain distance. That is because we have our snap size enabled over here. So every time you move it in a certain direction, it will move 10 units in that direction. You can click on this orange button over here to disable the snapping so that it will now move smoothly. If you set this to a higher value, such as 100, then the snapping becomes much more obvious. Similarly, for the rotation and the scaling, when you rotate, it will snap every 10 degrees, so that makes it much more easier to rotate things 90 degrees or 180 degrees or those sorts of common angles. The scaling, it is the same as all the rest. You can hit the orange button to disable the snapping, and at the moment, every time you scale, it will increase or decrease by 0.25. Then on the left of our viewport over here, we have different views which we can go through. So first of all, probably one of the most useful views is that we can change it between perspective and orthographic. If we look over here at the top, this is very useful for level building because you can more clearly see where everything is placed, and it is also in wireframe, so you don't have to worry too much about lighting or anything like that. This is purely for placing your objects and making sure they are where you would like them to be. If we go back to perspective here, we can also choose between all these different modes. This is lit, this is unlit, which basically disregards all your lighting preferences and settings so that all you see is the basic textures on your meshes. We can also switch to wireframe. This might be useful for looking at how many faces and vertices your mesh has, just to check whether it might not be very optimized for your scene. Obviously, the less faces you have, the less your console or computer has to process. So in general, when you're doing your modeling, just a general design tip is to make sure that they are low poly. This is detail lighting, where it places a slight emphasis on shadows, and this is lighting only. Reflections we will look at in our lighting and core concepts video, but for now, all you need to know is that all these modes are possible, and that they have their own various functions and you might need them for very different things. We're now in the player collision view, which shows us everything that has a collision that the player can collide with. As you can see earlier on in the tutorial, we took away the collision from the staircase over here, therefore it does not show up in our player collision tab. We are now going to go through some of the very common elements in Unreal that you'll be using throughout your time. And then we will look at some various settings which can be changed to make your experience easier. Okay, if we go into the content browser over here, you can now see that if we right click over here, we're going to briefly look at each of these 4 basic assets. Probably what I should have looked at a lot earlier is this level asset. So if we go into our third person maps here, you can see that there's this third person example map, which we are currently in right now. If you are making an open world game, perhaps you won't be using the levels asset as much as maybe anyone else, but essentially a map or level is essentially, as it says in the name, it is a pre-computed, preconceived, pre-built map, which obviously can vary from each other or be as similar to each other as you like. If I were to now create a new map and place a bunch of different meshes and assets in it, and then if I was to save it and then switch back to this third person example map, the third person example map would still look exactly the same, but our new map would look as we built it. So this is very useful if you're building a game which has traditional levels, for example, maybe a space scene and then a war scene or anything like that. It is also very useful to use maps for, you might have exactly the same scene, but different pre-computed lighting scenarios. For example, I might want to have exactly this same scene for another level in my game, but at night. So what I can do is create a new map with this exact same level and then just change the settings to night, which will obviously speed up the process instead of having to build every single asset exactly as it was and then change the level to night. Now that we've looked through levels, we are going to look through a material. So now I've created a new material over here. It is the convention with Unreal to name your material with the suffix _m. We'll go through those in a minute. So if I double click on this over here, it will open up the materials editor. Now, this looks very complicated and there are lots of different options to go through. We are going to be releasing a video basically to show you through the basics of the material editor, all its different functions, options, and differences. But for now, all you need to know is how to create a new material and how to open it up. So I'm going to close this and I'm going to delete this. Now we are going to look through an asset which is not over here, but is very important to Unreal nonetheless, which is a skeletal mesh. A skeletal mesh, as I've said earlier, is something that looks like this. You'll notice that static meshes, as you can see over here, are denoted by the light blue color at the bottom, whereas skeletal meshes are denoted by this pinkish purple color. Any skeletal mesh is made up of 3 things. The skeletal mesh itself over here, the physics asset, which I mentioned earlier, and the skeleton. So if I were to open up the skeletal mesh, you can see that this is what it looks like. As I said, you can see that it is subdivided into these 5 categories over here, as well as the animations and the blueprints. So now if I were to go into the skeleton, you can see that if I click show here and go to, if I go to character, bones, and show all hierarchy, this is the skeleton as it has been rigged in a 3D modeling program. On the left over here, if I click on any of these, it will select the corresponding bone, which can then be altered. This is basically how animations are driven in Unreal Engine and any other engine. It is basically a collection of rotations and translations of different bone groups. This will all be covered in a later tutorial, but for now, you just need to know that skeletons are, skeletal meshes are comprised of the skeletal mesh, its physics asset, and the skeleton itself. Something interesting to note is that if I were to drag this physics asset into our world, let's drag it a bit up. You can now see that I still have my snap size set on 100. So if I were to hit play over here, you can see that that physics asset has fallen and crumpled. There's a bit of something funny going on over there, but it's essentially crumpled like a ragdoll. It's called ragdoll physics. So it's basically taking into account all our different bone weights and vertex weights in order to create a semi-realistic simulation. So it's almost as if the bones are held up without any muscle around them. And this is kind of the process that is used for simulating character deaths in games and stuff like that. So I'm just going to delete him. That was just a bit of background knowledge for you. We are obviously going to go more in depth into animations, animation retargeting, and animation layering as we go along. But for now, this is just the very basics of our editor so that you know how to navigate your way around, where everything is, and all of that. We're just going to quickly go through 2 more of our basic assets, and then we are nearly done. A particle system is basically like what it sounds. It could be snow, fire, rain, smoke, anything you can think of. If I just search in our content browser over here, there's a fire particle system that comes with the starter content. If I drag it into my scene here, you can now see that we have this particle effect, which is actually made up of various different particle effects. But as I said, we're going to go through this more in detail at a later stage. Now you know that particle effects exist and they are very different from static meshes or skeletal meshes. Lastly, we are going to go through a blueprint. If I go over here and create a new blueprint class, you can see that all these different options come up with different descriptions next to them. So I will let you read through that by yourself just to differentiate between these different classes of blueprint. For now, I'm going to go through the third-person default character, which is an active blueprint, just to give you a basic idea of how a blueprint works. So I'm going to click on our third-person character. Here it shows us what the camera is seeing as we are moving throughout the world. You can either click to edit the blueprint here, or you can go to your third-person character inside the content browser. You can see that a blueprint is divided into 3 or more tabs at the top here. The event graph, which is essentially the math and the programming behind how your blueprint works. The construction script, which in this case is not utilized, but in many other blueprints is. And here we have the viewport, which is how your blueprint will look once it has been compiled. So now you can see that we have our mannequin skeletal mesh, which is over here, and it is being run by an animation blueprint, which is another type of blueprint class, which we will look at a later stage. You can see that these are the components that make up our blueprint. The capsule component is very simply the collision for our skeletal mesh, because if we were to use the actual collision of the skeletal mesh, it would require a lot more processing power than if we would just use a simple capsule shape. We have a camera boom, which basically just sets the camera at a set fixed distance behind your third player character. Then we have the character movement, which is inherited from the parent class, and we have all these different options for our character, such as walk speed, swim speed, crouch speed, and all of that. We have variables which run how the blueprint works, but for now, all you need to know that is a blueprint is a very powerful tool in Unreal that can essentially do anything you can think of. We're nearly done. We're just going to look at two more things. We're going to go into the Edit tab over here and go to Plugins. Now you can see that installed I have the Substance plugin, which allows me to use Substance Designer and Painter within the Unreal Engine using the live link. If I were to click Enabled over here, you'll now see that it says Unreal Editor must be restarted for the plugin changes to take effect. You can either choose to restart now or later. I'm not going to enable it, but you can now see that there are various different plugins which are built into the engine and you may need at some stage. But for now, you just need to know how to enable these. Lastly, we will be looking at the project settings. These are various different things you can see over here. Just quickly, we will look at maps and modes. You can see that for the moment, the game default map is the third-person example map. If you were to package this for console or for PC, you would obviously choose the map which was your starting level, and then you would have to work in a blueprint which would tell the engine how to change between levels. Here is some packaging options, which we'll obviously get to at a later stage. Inside the engine, we have input, which is how you would map your action and axis mappings for different keyboards, gamepads, VR, and whatever else you can think of. So just look through these various different settings. You may or may not need them as we go along. But for now, we have looked through essentially everything within the editor, and you should have a good grasp of how to navigate your way through Unreal Engine. Thank you very much for watching. The next video we will be looking at is the lighting and core concepts tutorial, where we'll be looking at in much greater detail lighting builds, the various different types of lights we can use, and various other settings, as well as a light map importance volume and the post-processing volume, which I didn't look at in this tutorial. But thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video, and if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to the channel.